Thank you for joining the American Values Coalition webinar on the Buffalo shooting and replacement theory. The American Values Coalition, we are working to counter right-wing disinformation and radicalization. We are a right-of-center organization, and we feel that conservatives and Republicans especially need to speak up and take a stand against the political radicalization that's taking place within their own circles of influence. I'm just talking now about American Values Coalition, not our guest speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment. So when it came to the Buffalo shooting this weekend, there's lots of issues that we could talk about related to that. There's the mental health question, gun laws, issues of absentee fatherhood. Do we need to regulate the internet? Conspiracy theories and why do they proliferate? All sorts of issues related to that. We're not going to talk about any of those. We're going to focus on what's been called replacement theory, or more broadly, white supremacy, and looking especially at the historical roots of that. So the shooter in Buffalo, and I should also add, and this is not to minimize the tragedy that happened also in California this weekend, but we don't know the motivations behind that one yet. So we are talking mainly here about the Buffalo shooting and shootings similar to that, like in El Paso, where the shooter did mention what's been called replacement theory, or sometimes white replacement theory, or the great replacement. So this is the idea that, there's various versions of this, but the notion that Democrats or liberals want to bring in more immigrants to add to their voting rolls in order to take control and take power, and then use that to punish conservatives or Republicans. So the notion of replacement theory, we should add that it's bogus, but it does ring true to a lot of people. It's bogus for many reasons. One is that, whenever you let someone immigrate to this country, a citizen is not replaced. They don't have to leave. So you're adding to, you're not replacing anybody. Also, when it comes to the Democrats, I think a lot of people forget that one of the biggest criticisms of Obama and his immigration policies were the huge number of deportations that was happening under Obama. So that doesn't make any sense with regard to replacement theory. And some people relate this idea to books or articles that have talked about, a future Democratic majority because of how the electorate is changing. But sort of a prediction about how the electorate is going to change is different than, trying to make that happen, for one. And secondly, those analyses have turned out to be terribly wrong as well anyway, because Republicans have not done poorly, continue to do worse among non-white people. In fact, Trump increased his share of non-white voters from 2016 to 2020. So those predictions were wrong to begin with anyway. So what we're going to talk about today with our speaker is the roots of replacement theory. And actually, we're going back deep roots of replacement theory, even before that term was coined, but that you could find those similar ideas in American history. And here to talk about this is Jesse Curtis. He's assistant professor of history out at Valparaiso University. He got his BA at Moody Bible Institute, his MA at Kent State University, and his PhD at Temple University. His teaching interests include the history of race in modern America, African American history, the history of Christianity, and global settler colonialism. He has a book called The Myth of Colorblind Christians, Evangelicals and White Supremacy in the Civil Rights Era. We may, if we have time, we may hit upon that as well. That was just published last November. And what really got my attention, on Monday, we put out a statement about the Buffalo shooting, talking about how a lot of those same ideas have been promoted in mainstream conservative and Republican circles members of Congress, Tucker Carlson on Fox News and other places. But that same day that we put out our own Buffalo statement about the Buffalo shooting, there was an editorial in the Washington Post by Jesse Curtis talking about how a lot of these ideas, similar to replacement theory, go way back in American history and have been very mainstream with both political parties. So that really got my attention. And so I contacted Jesse and asked him to come on. This is like the quickest webinar we've ever put together because we wanted to really get this out there while it's fresh on everybody's mind after the Buffalo shooting. So in that op-ed, he writes, in reality, white attackers are embedded in thick ideological contexts of sympathy and support in their communities. So talking specifically about how it's, we aren't just lone wolves, these shooters aren't just lone wolves, they're in the thick ideological context. So Jesse Curtis, thanks for joining us. So tell us a little bit more about, some of these ideas you talk about in the op-ed. Where do you see, when you looked at what happened in Buffalo and some of those ideas that were being, in that manifesto, talk about where you saw them in American history.
Yeah, well, thanks, Nap. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. When the media was reporting over the weekend on the content of this alleged manifesto, this racist screed, and describing it as, fringe and conspiracy theory and all of those kinds of words and internet radicalization, I'm looking at the content of what this shooter was saying. I'm saying, gosh, this sounds really familiar. This sounds like the white political mainstream a century ago. This was from the concern about white birth rates to fears of an immigrant takeover or invasion, all of these things, mainstream politics. So my point was not to say that it's wrong as such, right? To say, oh, conspiracy theory, internet radicalization. But I don't think we're going far enough. Even Fox News saying, wow, look at how Fox News has mainstreamed these things. But I'm suggesting, like, wait a minute, how are these ideas even thinkable in the first place? Where did they come from? What's the soil, the latent soil that allows these things to gain traction in the first place, right? And so these kinds of ideas about white people being under threat and needing to strike back, this was leading intellectuals a century ago, presidents of the United States. And in the op-ed, I started the story with this famous journalist, John O'Sullivan, who used that phrase, manifest destiny, that we've probably heard before. But we may not realize just how explicitly this was a white supremacist notion, that it was the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon peoples to take over the world. And so the very meaning of sort of white identity in a political context becomes bound up in these processes of conquest. And so one of the sort of through lines that I wanted to try to connect is to think about what happens when that very heady notion of conquest sort of turns and becomes fearful and paranoid, like we're not conquering anymore, now we're afraid of being conquered. And so I try to think of this white supremacist terrorism as kind of this ideological residue of the white supremacist conquest. I could just keep going on and on, Nap, with examples.
Yeah, and what about this notion of, talk a little bit more about, even though we're talking about, what white supremacist ideas, there's still sort of within that, this notion that the white people are the victims, like this is happening to them. And so they have to fight back because, they're the ones who are, being, well, replaced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it has to do with the origins of white identity, really. Um, we could go way back. There's a wonderful book by Catherine Gerbner called Christian Slavery, and she's looking at conversion and race centuries ago in the early Atlantic world. And, she takes us to the island of Barbados, for example, and says, look, I can show you the documents where the laws shifted from saying you need to be a Christian to hold office to you need to be white to hold office. Why? Because what happens if an enslaved person wins their freedom, converts to Christianity? There's nothing in the law preventing an African person from holding office, for example. All that to say, we see these very concrete processes where the political meaning of this new identity, where people start to refer to themselves as white, is very literally being white means you have an entitlement to rule over others. And so then, in context of threat, in the late 19th century, there's this shift that happens where this white identity that has been so associated with domination over others for a whole number of reasons begins to seem threatened, right? And part of it is this age of mass migration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Chinese folks are on the move. People from Southern and Eastern Europe are on, millions of people are moving around the world, right? And there's this fear that, even though white Americans, white Australians, and so on, we're dominant in the world, but people are looking around and saying, hey, you know what? There are a lot more of them than there are of us. What's going to happen here? And so all over the world in the early 20th century, in the settler states like Canada, Australia, the United States, there are these new immigration laws, explicit policies to make sure that these societies would stay white-dominated societies. The sort of corollary to it is this sense that white civilization is the pinnacle of human progress, right? But the problem with progress, the problem with being at the pinnacle, is that you become decadent. You become soft and lazy. And this is a very prominent discourse in the early 20th century. And Teddy Roosevelt, our president, was a leading proponent of this idea that we're becoming soft and effeminate. We need to fight. Life is about racial struggle. We need to raise our birth rates. I mean, he was explicit about this, that we need to raise our birth rates to avoid race suicide. And those kinds of ideas, race suicide, we think of that as white supremacist talk. But yes, Teddy Roosevelt was a white supremacist. And it's like, can we be honest about that and grapple with the fact that that was mainstream? That was the white American political tradition. And part of what I think is so chilling about it is that for a figure like Teddy Roosevelt, violence is baked in. Like, he was so explicit about saying that it is imperative that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and North America and Siberia are removed and replaced with the dominant races. He said this, right? And he continued to take an attitude toward violence that said, violence, war, these things are regenerative. these things are life-giving. These things are important to restoring health and vigor to the white race. I was studying this with my students this semester, and my students, quite surprised, they said, "This sounds like Hitler." And I said, well, yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, and then we had Woodrow Wilson after him. We have these progressive era presidents, all identifying as progressives.
Yes.
The word progressive today, is kind of takes from that history, right?
Yeah.
And they, yeah, and of course, I guess Princeton has recently sort of, I believe, sort of removed the Wilson name from there. So,
Yeah.
he was the former president of Princeton, but yeah, this was taking place with both political parties,
Yes.
and political parties that consider themselves sort of forward-thinking, progressive type thinkers.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point because, don't get me wrong, like Tucker Carlson deserves all the criticism he's gotten, right? But when we limit it to that, we're letting too many people off the hook here. Like so many of us are implicated in this. So many of our political traditions are implicated in this. And as you say, both parties, both Roosevelt and Wilson, they're forward-thinking people who believe that there's an important role for the federal government in enacting reforms and making people's lives better. And yes, they're white supremacists. And in some way, it's like we haven't been able to, I believe, incorporate that into our sort of narrative of American history. Like, how do we make sense of that? How do we take it seriously, but then also not be bound by that? Like that we can move on to better things, but I think it has to start with taking it seriously.
Yeah, and you brought up this message of making more babies. Of course, making more white babies is what they're talking about. And I want to be clear, there's concerns today about low fertility rate, and that are related to like the effects on the economy, and of course Social Security would collapse with we don't have more workers paying into the system. Those concerns usually lead people to agree that we need more immigration, not less. So that's a separate sort of thing than what we're talking about. So what you're talking about here is this notion of we need the concern that white people are being replaced by non-white people, and so increase your fertility of white babies, right?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And part of the reason that sense that fear of being replaced is so potent, because you were talking at the beginning, this great replacement theory, which in its more sort of mild forms takes out the anti-Semitic component and just sort of frames it as like, a partisan advantage that's being created, right? Like Democrats are bringing in new voters. But part of what it links to is this, because on one level, it's like, well, new voters, you can appeal to them as voters and win their vote. So what's the big deal, right? But it's this very old idea that links race to political capacities. This old idea that they're literally, race is not this mere phenotypical, skin color issue. Racial identity tells us something important about someone's political abilities. There are certain races that by nature are fit for self-government. This is how leading race thinkers were thinking. Like I mentioned, Madison Grant in the piece, he's like, oh yeah, the Nordic race are a race of adventurers and rulers, and other races, they're bystanders. They're meant to be ruled. And so this idea of new voters coming in, it's not just that they're new voters, it plays into that very old idea that on a fundamental level, these people don't understand American institutions and probably aren't even capable of exercising American freedoms. And so they must be excluded.
And feel free to go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Talk a little bit about how religion plays into this, and this notion that, it's God's design, for the white race to have leadership role and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I don't know that religion was important for this particular shooter, right? But in the big picture, it's been crucial, I think. And there's something more intractable about these ideologies when they seem to have divine sanction, divine approval. This is God's will, right? I mentioned Josiah Strong, this very influential Protestant minister, who, again, by the way, in terms of not just identifying the usual suspects, Josiah Strong, in some ways, was associated with the social gospel, which is seen as a more liberal thing. But Josiah Strong was very explicit about the idea that it was God's will for Anglo-Saxons to take over the world and basically eradicate races that he imagined to be inferior. And he was this respectable American minister. And so the racial and the religious are linked. And we've seen this throughout American history, a variety of strands of racism. Even in the civil rights era, we see some white pastors giving sermons where they're truly saying, being white is not just a race, it's a divine calling. The children of Israel were chosen a long time ago, and now God has chosen the white race for a special role in the world. And when you believe that, right, that gives you all of the permission you need to act ruthlessly. But I think in a much more sort of tame and mainstream way, there is this sense that just as America is and has been and should be a white nation, that it's a Christian nation, right? And I think that the challenge there is when that becomes, again, a politics that is trying to control and dominate. Because then what happens when you fear that control being lost? There is always that potential for the resort to violence. And so for me, part of, just putting my cards on the table, being very opinionated, I think part of the whole challenge and danger is that white identity politics, white Christian identity politics is inherently dangerous, is inherently prone to violence, which is not to say that Christian religious influence in politics is inherently bad or dangerous. I mean, think about the Black political tradition. Deeply informed by Christian faith, right? And yet in the Black political tradition, we see these struggles for freedom that have no expectation of dominating others. A struggle for an equal place in the country, but not a struggle to lord it over other groups, right? And so that's a very different political tradition.
The first question in our Q&A says, who is the worst offender of bringing the Great Replacement theory to the mainstream?
Well, I mean, you said it, Knapp. I mean, I think it is Tucker Carlson. I think he deserves all the criticism he's receiving. There's that one particularly atrocious quote that has been making the rounds, and part of what was notable about this particular quote from Carlson is that he used the term Great Replacement theory, which before recent years really was only used in white supremacist circles. So when Carlson used the literal phrase, it marked it as a white supremacist rhetoric. But the other thing he said in that moment was he talked about Democrats are bringing in more obedient voters from the third world. And again, what does that do? That plays into this very old notion that either by race or by culture, there are some people who are just, their political behavior is just different, and they're not capable of exercising American freedoms. They're more obedient. I heard that and I'm thinking, this is Madison Grant 1916 all over again, talking about these passive races that are designed to be ruled over. So yeah, I think Carlson is the biggest purveyor of this into the mainstream. But again, it's like, how are these ideas thinkable in the first place?
Yeah, and he's on Fox News, the most popular cable news channel, and has the most popular cable news show on television right now. So it's just the size of his audience makes him particularly important figure in promoting these ideas.
Yeah.
All right, we got a bunch of questions coming in. How do you help someone who you think might believe in great replacement theory or other racist ideas?
Yeah. Boy, well, if I knew that, no, well, I'll say one or two things. I think, well, this is almost, it's so vague as to be unhelpful, but I just think it's so important to listen. Like if especially like if you know this person, right, you're having a one-on-one conversation, that's a different situation, right? And listen, right? But I think that we must historicize race. We must, as clearly, I'll explain what I mean, as clearly as we possibly can, help this person to see that, you know, when we are condemning white supremacy, and we're talking about these things, we're not condemning all white people. We're not saying you're bad. We are speaking to this contingent process. We're not talking about people's essential natures. We're talking about this thing that humans invented, this ideology of race, this way of seeing each other that we made up. And that invention has had such destructive consequences. And we don't have to think that way anymore. We don't have to be bound by that. And I would point to other historical examples of saying, look, there are other ways of thinking about this. I think, for example, of Frederick Douglass, who is a Republican. He was a famous abolitionist before the Civil War. He had escaped slavery, probably the most famous Black orator of the 19th century. And he gave this speech after the Civil War, 1869 or so. And it's this overlooked speech that should be much better known, because in that speech, Douglass was wrestling with the very same thing we're wrestling with now. Like, how do we live together in this diverse nation? We have people from all over the world here. How do we do this? And at a time when people were wrestling with, you know, what's the status of the former slaves? What about all these Chinese immigrants coming to the West Coast? What about the Native Americans and this ongoing war in the West? And Douglass says, with all this diversity, with all these differences, our only security, he says, is perfect equality. And so at a time when there was all this hysteria about like Chinese immigration, Douglass said, would I say that they can become citizens? Yes, I would. Would I say that they can vote? Yes, I would. Can they hold office? Yes. And so Douglas is trying to get people to see. He says, look, there are some narrow-minded men who can't imagine that this is anything more than a white man's country. But Douglas says, that's not the American destiny I see. Douglas says, I see an America whose destiny is to be a home for all the peoples of the earth to live together in equality. And to me, that vision, I mean, look, like as you're talking to someone, the reality is some people are going to think that's a dystopia, right? Some people are just going to find that vision unappealing. I think there's hope that most Americans today can find that vision inspiring. But it requires, I think it still requires that we confront these zero-sum narratives, right? Of replacement, us versus them, immigrants are threatening our future. We have to get past that white identity politics that says, oh, an expansion of someone else's rights is a threat to my rights. Well, no, equality for all of us. If we enlarge the American tent, it doesn't mean I don't get to be under the protection of the tent anymore. So listen, right? It's not like that answer is going to convert someone, but that's what I've got.
Yeah, we're the American Values Coalition. I think definitely there's American values that we can draw upon to lead people towards that's different than what they believe in if they're attaching themselves to these racist ideologies. Just you talking about the how we teach American history and what you described as far as manifest destiny earlier. That's not how I was taught in high school at all. It's just not something that was ever mentioned in my high school history class.
That is so interesting. Yeah, and it's so characteristic of we portray these things almost as natural processes. We just spread over the continent. And whereas people at the time, Teddy Roosevelt and others, were very explicit about the brutal warfare that was required to make this happen. So, yeah.
Let's see. Why do you think some right-wing media outlets are pushing these ideas? Do they genuinely believe this, or is there another motive?
Well, it's dangerous to speculate about motives, right? I don't want to try to mind read too much, but this is one reason actually that I wanted to call attention to this deeper history of race and the sort of white American political tradition. My guess is that many of the purveyors of these narratives sincerely do not realize how dangerous the fire they're playing with is. This is the stuff of genocide and terrorism. It is. And I don't know that the purveyors of these narratives necessarily realize that. I think there's a sense that, maybe this gets me ratings, or maybe this wins me votes. And I think there's cynicism, right? That, we can, if we find this rhetoric to be useful, we can use it, and hey, nothing's really going to come of it. And obviously, I just think that's a disastrous mistake.
Yeah, this is a question I struggle with all the time as well. But when the New York Times recently did this multi-part series on Tucker Carlson, one of the things they highlighted was that he really does focus in on his ratings, and even like each segment, what does well gets a reaction from his audience and what doesn't. And so he's learning what his audience wants and giving his audience more of that. And at the same time, when he used that phrase, great replacement, like, where did he get that from? This was only something that was being promoted on white supremacist websites, and somehow it's making it from there, into his, his speech, his language. So Um,
I think, yeah, it seems likely that Carlson knows exactly what he's doing.
yeah.
Carlson in particular.
Why are white Christians so scared of losing political power? It seems so antithetical to a godly worldview.
Christ gave up power. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
he was offered power. He was offered
yeah.
great power.
Yeah. I mean, that power was one of the temptations in the wilderness, right? Right. That, yeah.
Yeah.
So I do think that, again, it relates to this sense that America is a Christian country, that it belongs to us as Christians. I say us because I am a Christian. This sense that we are entitled to ownership of the country. And so, from speaking not so much as a historian in this moment, but in terms of Christian orthodoxy, it seems so obviously an idol, like making an idol out of the nation, a kind of heresy, that so many American Christians look to America for safety, for belonging, and if we don't control it, so there is this kind of grasping for power, and I think the roots of that, just as with race, I think the roots of that again go back to the 19th century, because this was a moment where, I've emphasized the violent, the conquest. I've emphasized that, but in some ways I've distorted the picture if I don't mention the humanitarian impulse, the Christianizing impulse that was very strong, in the sense that we're ushering in the kingdom of God, and this very heady sense that American Christians were redeeming the world. And we are this sense that America was dominated by white Protestant Christianity. And, a whole host of forces in the late 19th century begin to break that down. Changing intellectual currents, Darwinism, mass migration, all of these things begin to make some Christians feel like strangers in their own country. And now, over a century later, that feeling is even stronger, right? So,
How did you get into the topic of your book? You wrote a book on evangelicals and the civil rights movement. So just talk a little bit about how that book came about and how it relates to your larger interest in racism in America.
yeah. Well, that book, because my own background is evangelical, I mean, it actually began in 2014 in the Black Lives Matter era, as I was seeing how my community was responding to racial justice protests and trying to make sense of it. I wasn't comfortable with how my community was responding, my religious community. And so I began to look at, okay, well, how did white evangelicals respond to the civil rights movement, right? And not well is the short answer. But I think part of what's interesting about that response is the way the rhetoric, the theology of race did change. It became much less overtly white supremacist and much more about sort of Christian colorblind ideals about being united in Christ. But those ideals, or that rhetoric, so often, rather than being a true basis for sort of a common ground politics or a common ground religious communities, so often that rhetoric has been used to actually hide problems. It's like saying, hey, we're all Americans, let's not pay attention to color. And we're saying that because we don't want to make reforms that are needed. So in terms of connections with race, it's very deeply connected. Just as we see a white identity politics that is kind of in a defensive mode, grasping for power. We see an evangelical politics that, as I was just saying about that long narrative of Christianity in America, in evangelical politics, it's grasping for power, trying to take back the country. So they're very closely linked, I think.
Yeah, and just for those who are watching, we did our previous webinar last month was on Christian nationalism, and we're gonna, if you missed that, we'll post it on our YouTube channel. And then we're also, you're the first to hear it, but our next webinar next month, we're going to have Georgetown professor Paul Miller, who's coming out with a book on Christian nationalism as well. So we're going to deal with that topic again next month. We haven't scheduled the date yet, but look for it sometime toward the end of June. Yeah, and so this is all related as well, I think, to our concerns about the political radicalization that's taking place on the right. And just talking about the civil rights movement, it just reminded me how, I've heard, just as an evangelical myself, so many evangelical leaders, white evangelical leaders, who said that, evangelicals got it wrong in the 60s. And we, and express regret and say, we should have done better as far as speaking out in defense of our brothers, Black brothers and sisters in Christ. But then, they have another opportunity now, right? With the radicalization that's happening on the right. And then also, during the Trump administration, with all the race baiting and xenophobia that was happening, there's another opportunity to get it right and to speak out. But there seems to be such reluctance to rock the boat, or concerns, about losing an election, or whatever it is. So, my message has been just throughout these is to, speak up, take a stand, and you don't regret like what those evangelicals in the 60s, regretted not doing back then.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next question was, what is your definition of terrorism? And do you believe that media outlets have a responsibility to call mass shootings like the one in Buffalo terrorism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Easier to answer the second part than the first. I do think there's a responsibility to name it as terrorism. And I think that, I think your question speaks to the double standard that there has been, in part based on the identity of who's doing the killing. Is it a person claiming Muslim faith? Is it a white American? We respond differently, right? My definition of terrorism, I hesitate to offer, I would say political violence, like public violence committed with political purpose. That may be too broad or too narrow. That's an off-the-cuff definition. But maybe I should take this question, to talk about this double standard around violence that has actually been percolating in the right, the conservative side of American politics for longer than I think we realize. I've already talked about, that this is bipartisan, going, back to the progressive era and all of that. But we shouldn't end this conversation without talking about William F. Buckley. I don't know if anyone in the room knows the name William F. Buckley. Knapp, I'm sure you do. Buckley, if more than anyone, Buckley was like the founding intellectual father of modern American conservatism, arguably. And he was kind of an intellectual and a movement builder at the same time. And he founded National Review magazine in 1955. But one of the things that's important about Buckley is, in the civil rights era, Knapp, as you were talking about, he very explicitly set up a double standard around violence and explicitly defended the use of white violence to maintain control. and people don't know this, right? That Buckley was making these arguments. The most infamous case, 1957, Buckley published this editorial, "Why the South Must Prevail," right? And this is during the Civil Rights Movement. And Buckley was saying, this bill moving through Congress for voting rights, this is a threat because if we enforce this, there are some counties in the South where whites are in a minority. And if we just enforced democracy and had the Constitution enforced in these places, Black people would be in charge. And Buckley explicitly says, well, the prerogatives of civilization are more important than democracy, and whites are entitled to rule. And he made it transnational. Just as these incidents of terrorism we've been seeing, it's transnational. This shooter inspired by the New Zealand shooter, those kinds of connections, right? For intellectuals, even in the 50s and 60s, there was this transnational defense of white violence. At the height of the conservative intellectual movement, from Buckley himself. And he said, you know, just as the British in Kenya put down that rebellion to stay in control of Kenya in this brutal war, so white Southerners are entitled to use violence if necessary to stay in control. That's sobering, and that kind of rhetoric actually intensified in the 60s. Buckley warned about race war. He said, you know, white Americans, we will go to war if we have to defend our way of life. And so I do think, you know, we've talked about Carlson, but I think there is this broader reckoning that is needed, that we're not even aware that these kinds of defenses of white violence have been present, you know, at the intellectual centers of the conservative movement in decades past. It's extremely sobering and
so
controversial to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I studied the conservative movement. I have a PhD in political science. I studied the Christian right. And that's the first time I ever heard that story. I mean, I knew Buckley as like one of the masterminds of the Southern strategy. I just hadn't heard like that specific, you know, appeal to violence before. Is it true that he later regretted that?
That's a good question. He, in a general way, he said, you know, I kind of missed it in the civil rights era. But to my knowledge, now, please hear me. I have not exhaustively, you know, looked at, I haven't, you know, Buckley's papers and so on, but I can only say I've not seen him give an accounting for the specific rhetoric in which he published Scientific Racists in the 60s, in which he defended violence and so on. I never saw him specifically account for that rhetoric, but he may have.
Okay. What or is there the relationship between CRT and the Great Replacement theory? I assume they're talking about critical race theory and Great Replacement theory.
Boy, that's a good question. I think that on the level of what those two things actually are, there's no relationship. You know, a theory about law and race, you know, in American academia, and on the other hand, this white supremacist theory, but on the level of social function in this age of reaction, they're very connected. Like the sort of hysteria about CRT that has been spreading for the same reason that the Great Replacement theory has been going mainstream, because we're in this moment of reaction, and really it has everything to do with the Black Lives Matter protests. And summer 2020 in particular, you know, it was a crazy time. it was a wild time. And I was in Philly, and in some ways it was scary. But it's a reliable dynamic in American history that an upsurge of protest for racial justice is going to produce a reaction. And I just think sort of conceptually, it's important for us to recognize our moment, that we're in a moment of reaction. We're in a moment where there's a concerted effort to hide, to cover over some of the racism that has been exposed. And so the function of CRT discourse is, well, let's not talk about racial justice. Let's not talk about legitimate reforms that might be helpful to move our country forward. Let's label it all as this scary thing that we can dismiss. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and we should probably just to clarify, there's CRT as it exists in academia and law schools and where it originated, which is very different from CRT as it's being presented in a lot of conservative places today.
And that's such an important point to just emphasize, Nat, because, and I want to say that it's not as though CRT is some kind of sacrosanct thing that gets it right. Like in my book, I make a critique of CRT, for example, but that's the kind of discourse that is helpful. Like we debate each other and we disagree, but it's not this fear-mongering discourse of this thing being the enemy of, you know, all that is good.
Yeah. Next question is, we have talked about right-wing media outlets. Are there any liberal examples you can think of where some of these racist ideas have become mainstream?
That's a great question. Mainstream, I don't know that I would say mainstream. I wonder if, it seems to me, and others in the conversation, others in the room, like you may be able to think of examples more readily than I can, but it seems to me that there are unique problems on the left, but they're just different sorts of problems. I've said, you know, beware the age of symbolic anti-racism, where there's this kind of rhetorical preoccupation with saying the right words, with referring to people with the right jargon, this group and that group, and it's like, well, what's the point of all this? Like what are we accomplishing here? So I do think that for white liberals, and again, it's not a precise corollary to white conservatives, but it's a different kind of problem. For white liberals, there is the danger of this kind of self-flagellating kind of politics that's not doing anything useful. Like, oh, I have racism in me and I'll never understand the experience of people of color, and it's like we're more comfortable sitting in that mode than doing something practical and useful to be in solidarity and build a politics of common ground. And so I think that there are particular ways in which we need to be race conscious. We need to pay attention to the realities of the history of American racism. But then we also need to be able to come together, not in ways that hide racial discrimination, but to come together in common ground and in solidarity and say, we're all human beings here together who can move forward together as Americans. And in some ways, the left, I think, has almost become hostile to that kind of common ground politics. And I'll get in hot water from both sides now in saying those kinds of things, but that's just my very personal idiosyncratic opinion about it.
Yeah, when you were saying that, it brought to mind to me how in a lot of liberal places they promote the use of this term Latinx, and where most Hispanics just do not want to be called that, but they continue to use it, even though the data shows, it's more of a turnoff than anything.
Right. Yeah.
But just talking about sort of practical things, what about just like for the average sort of, soccer mom or somebody who just has like, they don't have like a big platform, but just in their own lives, maybe in their church or whatever, what can they do to address the problems of racism in America?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think partly in keeping with the theme of our conversation here today, I'm not trying to give an exhaustive answer or anything like that, but to recognize white identity politics, to recognize the zero-sum narratives when you see them and hear them in your community, in your church, these narratives of being under threat, of being under siege, and being able, in hopefully a winsome way, right, to be able to interrupt those narratives and say, you know what, I think we can all get along. I don't think, immigrants are a threat to us, and whatever the case may be. And I also think there's something to be said for, you said practical, and I'm so bad at being practical. I'm an academic, just like to talk, but like wherever we are, wherever we find ourselves, trying to move closer to situations or people of who are marginalized. I mean, this is Brian Stevenson's riff. Brian Stevenson, the attorney, he wrote the book Just Mercy, and he talks a lot about proximity, right? Moving to where the hurt is, right? And I mean, that could be all the way up to literally moving, like I'm going to sell my house and move, but it could be in much more mundane ways, like where can I volunteer, right? Where can I do something that brings me into practical contact with people who are different from me, right? And I just think that as a historian, obviously I want to give a plug for just learning, right? Reading books, reading scholars, reading people like Jamar Tisby, who's been engulfed in that wave of anti-CRT talk. Hey, I'm going to stand up for Jamar. He's still a great guy, even though people are maligning him. Reading his books, he does great work. Anyway, I'm just rambling. There are others who would do such a much better job of hard-hitting practical advice for concrete things that you could do.
Speaking of books, your book is The Myth of Colorblind Christians, Evangelicals and White Supremacy in the Civil Rights Era. And then also check out Jesse Curtis's Washington Post op-ed on the mass shooting in Buffalo reflects deeply rooted American ideas. Jesse Curtis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Knapp. It was a privilege, and thanks to everyone who participated.